I remember back when I first arrived in North America with almost no money, just a backpack, a head full of ideas, and the belief that computers and the internet were going to transform everything long before most people saw it coming. And the funny thing is that my very first real invention, the one that put me on the map and gave me my first real exit, wasn't rockets or electric cars or brain-machine interfaces or solar energy systems. It was something far more humble, a digital business directory called Zip2 that my brother Kimball and I built in a tiny rented office with barely enough space for 2 desks. And back then the internet looked nothing like it does today. Websites were primitive, loading times were slow, and most newspapers didn't even understand what online presence meant. So what I envisioned was a digital map and directory service. Basically, something like an online version of the Yellow Pages, but with mapping features and the ability for local businesses to show up on this new digital frontier, which sounds obvious now, almost trivial, but at the time it was considered weirdly futuristic. And what we were doing at Zip2 was giving newspapers and businesses the ability to connect to this strange new digital world. And the truth is, we were working insane hours, sleeping on beanbags, showering at the YMCA, coding until the sun came up. And it was all fueled by the belief that if we could create a digital infrastructure for local business information, something big might happen. And eventually it did, because after years of grinding, after countless pitches and rejections and slow early adoption, the company finally gained real traction and attracted serious attention, and ultimately Compaq came in with an acquisition offer that turned everything upside down. And when the deal closed, I personally made about $22 million, which at that point felt surreal because I'd gone from sleeping on the floor to having enough capital to actually pursue the bigger ideas that were constantly swirling in my head. And honestly, that money wasn't about buying stuff. It was fuel. It was the launch pad. It was the beginning of everything that came later. Because with those resources, I could finally start working on the kind of things I'd been dreaming about for years, like online financial systems that eventually became X.com and later merged into what the world now knows as PayPal, and eventually rockets and cars and energy and all the other crazy things people know me for today. But it all traces back to Zip2, that first invention, built in a tiny office with no real plan except to make something useful for the future. And that early success didn't just change my life financially. It changed my belief in what was possible when you combine relentless effort, a willingness to look crazy, and the stubborn refusal to quit even when no one else believes in your idea. So, if there's one thing to take away from that chapter of my life, it's that big things almost always start as small things that everyone else ignores until suddenly they don't. And that first invention taught me that if you build something that pushes the world forward even a little bit, the momentum you gain can eventually move mountains. After Zip2, I didn't sit back or rest because $22 million might sound like a lot. But in my mind, it was just the starting capital for the next challenge. And the next challenge had to be bigger, bolder, more world-changing. And that's when I turned my attention to online finance, because I had seen firsthand how the internet could transform business. And I realized that money was still trapped in the old systems, moving slowly, full of friction. So I co-founded X.com, which was essentially an online bank, and people thought I was crazy again because banks were conservative, slow, and regulated to death. But I had this vision that financial transactions should be as fast, frictionless, and global as email. And I poured everything into making that happen, learning on the fly about regulations, code and systems, user experience, and the kind of security challenges that would make anyone else panic. But eventually X.com merged with Confinity, which had this product called PayPal, and the combined company focused entirely on online payments. And we just rode that wave as e-commerce exploded. And again, people said we were over-ambitious, but by the time eBay acquired PayPal in 2002, I personally made around $180 million, which was, again, not a number I spent on luxury. It was fuel for the next set of moonshots. Because I realized at that point that real impact wasn't about making money. It was about tackling problems that were massive in scale, problems that might not even have been solvable yet. And that's when the ideas for SpaceX, Tesla, and later Solar City and Neuralink started crystallizing in my head. Because I saw that transportation, energy, and human survival were all interconnected, and if you wanted to make a difference at the level that mattered, you couldn't just create another app or another website. You had to go to the extremes. You had to challenge physics and bureaucracy and public perception all at once. And I knew that the only way to do that was to take risks that most people considered lunacy, and that willingness to risk it all traces directly back to Zip2, to that first invention, because it taught me that if you can take an idea from zero to a functional product, from obscurity to acquisition, you can do it again and again, scaling up in ambition each time. And so, every success and every failure after that, every rocket that exploded on the launch pad, every car prototype that missed production deadlines, every sleepless night trying to figure out battery chemistry or launch trajectories was just another iteration on the lesson I learned in that tiny Zip2 office, that the world changes because people refuse to accept the limitations everyone else sees, and the real thrill isn't in the money. It's in the chance to create something that endures, something that future generations can look back at and say, yeah, that changed everything. And honestly, that's what drives me every day. That same spark from my first invention, that first taste of turning an idea into reality, and knowing that the next impossible thing is just waiting to be built. After PayPal, I had money, sure, but that wasn't the point. The point was the freedom to tackle problems that were existential, problems that mattered on a global scale. And I had been obsessed with space ever since I was a kid, reading science fiction in South Africa, staring at the stars and thinking, if humanity doesn't become a multiplanetary species, we're limiting our future in the most fundamental way. So, I took a big chunk of what I had made and started SpaceX, knowing full well that people would think I was insane, because rockets had always been the domain of governments, costs were astronomical, failures were deadly, and yet I believed that with engineering rigor, clever design, iterative testing, and a willingness to fail fast and learn faster, we could do what the incumbents couldn't. And the first few years were brutal. Our first 3 launches failed, and each failure was a gut punch. Not just financially, but emotionally. But giving up wasn't an option, so we learned, adapted, redesigned, and on the 4th launch, we succeeded. and that was the moment the impossible started to feel possible. The moment we proved that private enterprise could reach orbit. And once that was done, the next step was obvious. Reusable rockets, cheaper access to space, the goal of colonizing Mars, building the infrastructure to make humanity multi-planetary, because solving the long-term survival problem requires thinking in decades, not fiscal quarters. And while all this was happening, I was also obsessed with energy and transportation here on Earth, because I realized that the future of cars, energy storage, and sustainability were connected. So I invested in Tesla when it was on the verge of collapse, poured myself into the company, slept on the factory floor, and pushed relentlessly for electric vehicles that were not just eco-friendly, but aspirational, fast, and desirable. Because changing behavior isn't about preaching, it's about making people want the better choice. And we faced bankruptcy more than once. Production hell, supply chain chaos, lawsuits, skepticism from every angle. But we persisted, and today Tesla isn't just a car company. It's a statement about what technology can do when it's ambitious, integrated, and relentless. And looking back, everything I've done since Zip2, the failures, the sleepless nights, the enormous risks, the public scrutiny, traces back to that first tiny company, that first invention, that first taste of turning an idea into reality and having it succeed against the odds. Because Zip2 taught me that if you are willing to put in the work, to absorb the failures, and to keep going when everyone else says no, you can build things that genuinely change the world. And that's what I try to do every day. In space, on Earth, and hopefully eventually on Mars, because the thrill is never in the money. It's in proving the impossible can be done, and in that sense the first invention never really ended. It just grew bigger, riskier, and more consequential, and the lessons from it echo through every rocket launch, every Tesla on the road, every solar panel deployed, every battery installed, and every time I stare at the night sky and think, we can do better, we can go further, we can last longer. And that drive, that obsession, that refusal to accept the ordinary started in that small office with a tiny company called Zip2, and it hasn't stopped since.